It's just a wonderful tribute to the work that we're doing to have you all here. So on behalf of the staff and the board of the ICJS, welcome to our 25th anniversary celebration. I'm pinching myself to even fathom 25 years. Well, 25 years ago, a remarkable coalition of Christians and Jews, men and women, black and white, came together out of the conviction that neither our community nor our world can flourish in the midst of religious hostilities and dysfunctional rivalries. We simply must confront the pathologies of the past if we are to discover that our religious diversity is a blessing to celebrate and not an obstacle to overcome. We figured that it would take us about 3 years to raise the collective consciousness of our city, and then we would tidy up, clean up the mess of those 2,000 years of complex history. But it turned out the task of dismantling religious distortions that are deeply etched into our traditions is a more complicated task than we had imagined. We discovered that a great deal more is demanded of us if we are to reverse those habits of mind and heart that have pitted Jews, Christians, and Muslims against one another. Tonight, we want to take our breath and express our deep gratitude to all those who have embraced this daring educational vision and make certain that the mission is anchored on solid ground.
Be present at our table, Lord. Be here and everywhere adored. Thy creatures bless and grant that we may feast in paradise with thee. Amen.
We have asked 4 special friends of the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies to reflect on the significance of its work and its impact on their lives. We will begin with Bob Patterson, former rector of the Church of the Redeemer and one of the founders of the ICJS, who came all the way down from Maine to be with us. Bob, it's great to have you here.
To be here on this really festive occasion is not only for me a distinct privilege, but a kind of homecoming. Being with people that helped with my involvement in ICJS and other things before the birth of our cherished institution enriched my life and expanded my faith by dealing with Jews and other Christians. So I treasure the opportunity to come back and say thank you to so many. Now a question. How many of you attended some or all of the 9th National Workshop of Christians and Jews at the Sheraton Inner Harbor in May of 1986? How many of you were there for part of it? Well, we didn't know it at the time, but we were part of the experience that led to the birth of ICJS. Here's a backstory of how the 9th workshop happened to come to Baltimore. Roseanne and I attended the 8th workshop. It meets every 18 months in St. Louis in the autumn of 1985. The city that had been selected to do the 9th National Workshop had to withdraw its invitation, and another host city had to be found. But they would have only half the usual planning time of 3 years. Well, in our innocence, Roseanne and I thought it would be nifty if we could bring the 9th workshop to Baltimore, and she suggested that I give Stanley Solons, executive of the Baltimore Jewish Council, a call to see if he thought we could invite the next workshop to be here. And Stanley gave the idea a thumbs up, and the rest is history. Had we not done this, and had not Stanley affirmed doing this, I doubt very much we would be here tonight. It's that important. A small incident, but look what's happened. Baltimore already had the legacy of Lawrence Cardinal Sheehan and Rabbi Jacob Agus breaking barriers and building bridges between Jews and Christians, and we had also, in the late 70s, early 80s, two groups, Roman Catholics and Jews meeting with Frank Murphy, and Stanley and I worked with a Protestant Jewish dialogue group. And Frank and I agreed with Stanley that it was time to merge these two groups, and that became a source of leaders for making the Workshop 9 a viable project. The 9th workshop was called a landmark event by those who were involved in past workshops across the nation. And I was more than fortunate to work with Frank Murphy and Mark Loeb in helping develop the workshop's program. We bonded as brothers, something I had not expected. And because I'm an only child, the success of that is a deeply significant part of my life. I found two brothers. The momentum and vibrancy generated in the planning and success of that event did not cease when the workshop was over. Following the workshop, there was a surging enthusiasm for ongoing interfaith cooperation. We were ready to develop an entity that could bring together Jews and Christians through study and encounter in pursuing a relationship that would benefit the whole community, expose us to each other's faith traditions, and in so doing, lead us to reflect openly on our own. Leaders in business, law, education, finance, the arts, and the religious community, women and men, believed we in the Baltimore area had the ingredients of interest, financial support, organizing skills, and commitment to make this work. And indeed, we did. You did. Of course, enthusiasm alone is never enough for something of this magnitude. Needed were people who could translate this vision into concrete, specific reality. Enter the birth of ICJS and the initial leadership of Charlie Obrecht, Rick Berndt, Bernie Manikin, and others, a Protestant, a Roman Catholic, and a Jew. Note that all three were laity, not clergy. And in that fact, I believe, is the genius that nurtured ICJS through its infancy and development. we began hoping, but not knowing, that ICJS would be more than a 2-year experiment. We searched nationally for the right person to be our executive director, and we found Chris Layton right here in Baltimore on the Gilman School faculty. Chris was completing his doctoral work and was ready for a new venture. Now, 25 years later, we look back and marvel at his academic world, his depth of scholarship, his credibility with other scholars, a keen sense of what the Institute is and can become, clarity about interfaith issues, a winsome way with people, and a rare combination of patience and persistence, and through it all, a sustaining humility and a sense of humor. In the 25 years since 1987, the ICJS has touched literally thousands of people with programs such as the Genesis Project that reached a broad band of people from high school students to people in the state prison. And I will never forget the early morning showing of Schindler's List to hundreds of students. Before the showing, the kids were sleepy and restless and a bit noisy, but at the end, there was a time of hushed silence. For a few moments, nobody moved or spoke. And in the small group gatherings later, the kids' sensitivities of their participation showed they had been profoundly influenced by the morning's experience. In my years with ICJS, I have witnessed people moving through interfaith tolerance, beyond that to genuine mutual respect, beyond inhibiting suspicion to a really profound trust, beyond overlapping monologue to authentic dialogue where we both speak and listen. And in so doing, we learn and grow in wisdom in our respective faith traditions, and on the ground we share in common. We bring healing to a fractured world, Tikkun Olam. We do not gloss over our differences, but deal with those responsively and creatively. ICJS provides common ground that nurtures an environment for Christians and Jews to engage each other in studying our sacred texts and how they influence what we think and say and do every day. This evening is to recall and celebrate our past 25 years, but this is not so much a focus in a rearview mirror as it is a prologue to what lies ahead. We have proven ICJS can look ahead, and we have been doing that since the mid-1980s. We live, however, in a world where partially veiled prejudice and disrespect still exist, where seething rage and violence still are fueled by distorted, rigid religious ideologies. These are daunting challenges. Alone we may retreat from the formidable future, and many do just that. Yet tonight's celebration is testimony that there can be another way. Jeffrey Sachs closes his book, The End of Poverty, with this quote from a speech Robert Kennedy gave in Cape Town in 1966. Let no one be discouraged by the belief there is nothing one man or one woman can do against the enormous array of the world's ills. Few will have the greatness to bend history, but each of us can work to change a small portion of events. And in the total of all those acts will be written the history of this generation. Therein, I believe, lies the continuing spirit of the ICJS and our journey together. Thank you.
Welcome, everyone. 25 years is a nice round number. It is a wonderful period. It's a substantial period. But let's not kid ourselves. In the deep pool into which we've jumped in this task, 25 years is nothing. Just think about the great cycles of history that people have to push through for the rare moments that come of fundamental change in our sense of enemies and our sense of common possibility and in the things that we take for granted. After all, it took 250 years for people to realize that torture was not a wonderful instrument to purify rather than to profane the Christian faith through the Inquisition. These things last a long time. We have been living in our lifetimes, most of us, since the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered. Right after World War II, another great cataclysm. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, and part of the ICJS's purpose, has been facilitated by these documents that opened a window into the common birth of rabbinic Judaism and Christianity after the great cataclysm of the destruction of the temple in the Roman wars. And these documents produce a sense of awe and wonder about people struggling from all different perspectives with very fundamental questions about religion and about what binds us and separates us. In history, these things are equally rare and take a long time. After all, 100 years after the Civil War was a great cataclysm about the issue of slavery in the United States. My textbooks in Atlanta still taught me that the people who came afterwards to restore white supremacy in the South were called redeemers. That's the official category. It's still in some textbooks, a religious word for terrorists. That's how persistent some of the needs are to restore comfortable categories about how we sit in the world, with whom we sit, who are our friends, who are our enemies. We're trying to transcend that. The ICJS, therefore, is in a deep pool, and we have to be conscious of the fact that we're starting with personal belief, personal odysseys, but we're interacting with great swaths of history. It calls for courage, it calls for humility, it calls for a sense of where we are. In my own work, one of the most productive encounters that I had on these large subjects was in scholarship about Dr. King's good friend, Abraham Heschel. And I've told some of you these stories before, that Heschel told Dr. King that he believed that the prophets, the Hebrew prophets, provided the underpinnings for democratic faith in that the doctrine of equal souls before God prefigured the notion of equal votes. That all our votes count together. And therefore, this religious yeast that takes root in times when our politics boil to the surface and in a creative period that goes forward is a good interaction between secular and religious philosophy, struggle, reaction. And Heschel's signature phrase was that awe is the beginning of wisdom. A sense of awe about how many faces are in this room, how many lives, how many stories, and what binds us all together, and how in rare moments of quiet you can realize that. Now, I took this very seriously until I got out to Chicago once when I was doing a story about the relationship between blacks and Jews and their immigration patterns into the city of Chicago over a century. And in the course of doing research for that, I went up on the North Shore of Lake Michigan to visit a rabbi and talk to him about these patterns, and he was a Heschel scholar, and he was talking about awe. And I was explaining to him how profound I thought this was, and he started laughing at me. And he said, "Son, don't you realize as soon as this is the original insight of monotheism, that this awe should prevent us from taking little pieces of ourselves and turning them into God and worshiping Him, that monotheism won't allow us to do that. As soon as we had this insight, whose fundamental tenet is to suppress your pride and have a sense of awe, we became proud of it." He said, "That's the basis of Jewish humor." He said, "Right here in my synagogue, I pray all the time saying, 'Thank you, Lord, for making me aware at times that I am nothing.'" And he says, "I was praying like that the other day, and the assistant rabbi came by and joined in the prayer. And then the cantor came, and the three of us were joined in the prayer. And then our first female president of the congregation came by, and she joined in the prayer. And the cantor turns to me and says, 'Who is she to say she's nothing?'" That this intimate relationship between discovery and what binds us and the stubborn need to have some place that we can stand hold is part of what we're struggling with. We are blessed now. We don't know when the next great creative period is going to come in politics. We don't even know whether in the field of religion, the largest stress is going to be between the enmities that we're still dealing with, that we recognize within the faith groups. It could also be, half the time when I talk to people about the mission of the ICJS, they say the problem is all religious people. And there the question is, are secularists and anti-religious people as aware also that without the same sense of awe, their pride doesn't need any religious enmity to create an awful lot of evil in the world? So we have to bear in mind how hard it is, what a tenuous state it is, to learn from one another, to realize that we're in great swaths of history on fundamental things, and we have a hard time reminding ourselves of the great leaps from tension that we can feel right here in this room. It hasn't been that long ago that people in this room were not comfortable even talking with one another. Never take that for granted. It's a really hard thing. It's like taking votes for granted, that we settle most disputes by votes rather than by swords and fires and rape and pillage and conquest. That's a wonderful thing, and we have moved that way. But underneath it all lies the sense of awe, the sense of wisdom, the sense of reaching out, the sense of being uncomfortable, of getting outside of your settled norms because you find awe there and it binds you together and it releases wonder and it releases energy and it releases doubt, but it's creative. So that at a certain point, you're not comfortable unless you're a little uncomfortable. And that's getting outside of yourself, and to me, that's what Heschel meant when he said awe is the beginning of wisdom. Because when you get out there and say there's more between us than we're aware of, we can learn it, but we're going to have to work hard at it, but you can't do it alone. You have to start alone, but you can't do it alone. You've got to be reaching out. And that's what ICJS has been doing, and in the great historical context, it has been a thrill for me to be a part of it, and it is a solemn, awesome admonition for me to say, keep doing it, keep reaching out. This is a historic and wonderful organization that has already felt resonance in history and has an opportunity to create a lot more. Thank you.
We were taught, or should have been, that one of the ways that God reveals God's self is through the other. Ira Stone captures the Jewish view very well. We cannot see the face of God and live, but we can see the face of our neighbor, which is an image of God's face in this world. The question is, who is the other? Who is our neighbor? Those who first suggested that human beings are the image of God in the world had a very narrow view of the other. Since their theologies could not, would not accommodate the other, God's image in the world was severely restricted, and in most places on earth it still is, even in Baltimore. Enter Charlie Obrecht. He started to change the landscape of our community. My theological background, day school, yeshiva, Jewish theological, all three embraced the methodology of the Lithuanian yeshivot. Study of sacred texts trumped all other human endeavors. Intelligence was prized and rewarded. In truth, it was a system that encouraged intellectual arrogance, and I was seduced. Enter Chris Layton. The values of the Lithuanian yeshiva method sans the arrogance. To see in the face of our neighbor, in every human being, an image of God's face in the world, does that image not also include our neighbor's faith? If it does, which I affirm, to love one's neighbor requires knowing our neighbor's faith. You can't know me if you have little awareness of Judaism and how my entire life is formed by that tradition. Nor can I know you if I know nothing about your faith. Without that knowledge, it's just love light, which may be okay for a beer, but not of particular interest to me, and it doesn't cut it in human relationships. Welcome to ICJS, which is an experiment in the study of sacred text, sharing our living faiths, discovering what we share in common, learning more about whom we are, and in the process learning to love one another, because we can see in the face of the other an image of God's face in the world. We discover, too, what we cannot and do not share. The only way we can understand our theological bottom line, the only way to be firm in the boundaries of our own faith, is to test them. And the only way to test them is in a secure environment. That is hard to find. ICJS is such an environment for which I have and continue to be grateful. We love one another around ICJS, not love as an emotion, but love as motion. How we live with faith in this crazy, explosive world. Ours is a religious community, and I am privileged to be part of it, of all of you. Thank you.
Unlike the first creation, the creation of the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies did not occur ex nihilo, out of nothing. While many direct factors contributed to its creation, I would suggest that perhaps the single greatest factor, albeit indirect, was the Second Vatican Council of the Roman Catholic Church. This past Thursday, October 11th, 2012, marked the 50th anniversary of the opening of this historic council. One cannot, I think, overestimate the radical and far-reaching sea change this gathering of the world's bishops had on the Church's self-understanding, on its relationship to the world, on Catholic identity, and indeed on the entire religious landscape. Since the Council of Trent some 400 years earlier, the Catholic Church's attitude toward and understanding of the world and its religions might most charitably be summed up as disdainful, suspicious, defensive, and hostile. The church may have found itself in the world, but that was an unfortunate accident of history. It most assuredly wasn't of the world or for the world. Against this backdrop, the election of Angelo Giuseppe Roncalli on October 28, 1958, did not appear to be anything remarkable. Pope John XXIII, the name he chose, was elected as a compromise candidate. He was the only one that the progressive bishops and the traditionalists could agree on. Let us choose this elderly, lifelong church diplomat as a placeholder for the next few years while each of us shores up our numbers to ensure a candidate from among our ranks to be his successor. What harm could a 77-year-old do? I can hardly wait. He was a quite pleasant sort, rotund, kind, jolly. He had a self-deprecating sense of humor, the perfect choice to put a human face on the church after the long, contentious, and dour pontificate of Pius XII. But to everyone's astonishment, that same Spirit of God that hovered over the waters of that first creation chose to rest upon this good and holy man. 3 months into his pontificate, on January 25th, 1959, good Pope John, as he is so affectionately remembered by so many of us, gathered together a small group of cardinals for evening prayer at the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome to celebrate the conclusion of the Week of Prayer for Christian Unity. After Vespers, to that modest gathering of prelates, John announced his intention to convene an ecumenical council, a formal gathering of all the bishops of the Universal Church, what we have come to know as the Second Vatican Council, which met over 5 sessions from 1962 to 1965. One of the most important events to take place during the intervening years in preparation for the council occurred on June 13th, 1960. On that date, John XXIII met privately with the French Jewish historian and educator, Jules Isaac, whose wife and daughter had been deported to Auschwitz in 1943 and executed in its gas chambers. Isaac had authored works on Jesus and Israel and on the origins of anti-Semitism. In preparation for his meeting with the Pope, Isaac had prepared a lengthy memorandum outlining the Church's centuries-old teaching of contempt for Judaism and the Jewish people. He presented it to the Pope with the hope that the upcoming council might provide an opportunity for the Church to carefully reconsider its relationship with the Jews. The last entry in Isaac's personal notes of that historic meeting read thus, and I quote, "To my request, the Pope responded immediately and enthusiastically, quote, 'Since the beginning of our conversation,' John said, 'I also have had this thought.'" Isaac's notes conclude with this line. Again, I quote, "In telling him of all my gratitude for his welcome, I asked if I might carry away a bit of hope. and the Pope cried out to me, "You have a right to more than hope." Historians of the Council recount that this visit between John the 23rd and Jules Isaac was the single most important catalyst in prompting John the 23rd to personally request the preparation of a draft document on the Jews for deliberation by the Council Fathers, the document that we know as Nostra Aetate, in our time, approved on October 28, 1965. In it, the Roman Catholic Church repudiates for all time, the charge of deicide it leveled against the Jewish people for 2 millennia, and denounces any interpretation of sacred scripture that presents a pejorative view of Judaism and the Jewish people. Henceforth, no Catholic who wishes to remain obedient to the magisterial teaching of the Roman Catholic Church may, under any circumstance, read, interpret, or quote the Bible to justify presenting the Jewish people as killers of Christ or as accursed and rejected by God. In one brief, dense paragraph, the Roman Catholic Church overturned 2,000 years of anti-Jewish teaching and preaching and ushered in an era of remarkable renewal. What follows is, although I hadn't planned it, a lesson in why we have 4 Gospels. I now am going to recount my recollection of the origins and beginnings of our institute. And you will see that there is truth and there is truth. These and these. In 1985, I recollect, I had the privilege to travel to St. Louis with a small contingent of Jews and Christians who had been involved in Jewish-Christian dialogue for many years. We were there to attend the 8th National Workshop on Jewish-Christian Relations, and I remember all of us sitting at dinner one evening, discussing the events of the day. And I remember Charlie Obrecht, in his most modest fashion, saying, "Baltimore will host the next workshop. We can do so much better than this. We need to make unequivocally clear the imperative to educate Christians in the history of the Church's anti-Jewish teaching. We need to confront this legacy straight on, because the health and vitality of our religious communities, of our city, depended upon disarming religious hatred." And so we returned to Baltimore, and under Charlie's leadership, we began to plan the 9th National Workshop. And almost from its onset, I recollect, we came to realize that a conference alone could not create the kind of lasting change we knew we wanted to effect. That would take something more than a workshop, and so it happened. The creation of the Institute for Christian and Jewish Studies. From its inception, the dream of the ICJS was a noble one. Our plan, simple, elegant, and totally outrageous. We were, in 3 years, going to focus our attention on religious leaders, and through careful, serious, and intense study, we were going to reinsert into the Christian imagination the tortured history of Jewish-Christian relations, a history the pages of which had been torn out of our history books, a legacy of contempt that most Christians were simply ignorant of. We were going to leave no comfortable wiggle room We would be an equal opportunity discomforter. The health of the church depended on exercising this longest hatred. The credibility of the gospel depended on it. A gospel of love had, over the course of 2,000 years, been transformed slowly but profoundly into a theology of hate. And it was given to us in our time to right this wrong in 3 years. It may not have been ours to complete the task, though I recollect that we thought we could. But made aware of it, neither could we walk away. 50 years ago, when John the 23rd announced the convening of the council, the image he used was of the church throwing open its windows and letting the fresh air of the world blow through. He called for an aggiornamento, a new day in which the church would come to understand itself not only as truly in the world, but identified with its hopes and its joys, its griefs and its anxieties, a statement captured in the opening paragraph of Gaudium et Spes, the pastoral constitution on the church in the modern world. 25 years ago, the ICJS unlocked a few windows. We pushed them open, and we dared to let the fresh air of new scholarship blow through our hearts and our minds. In these intervening years, that fresh air has taken us to many places, the most exciting of which have been serendipitous. Now, 25 years later, I would like to think that in some small but significant way, the ICJS embodies the words John the 23rd spoke to Isaac in 1960. I would like to think that the Jewish community might look upon our work and say, "You have given us more than hope." Focus moments in a shared life are always occasions to celebrate who we are, how we came to be, what have been our best accomplishments, and they are occasions for giving thanks to and for all those men and women who have supported us so generously throughout this quarter century. But more importantly, moments such as these require us to think forward. 25 years ago, there was no blueprint for how to do this. There were no models upon which we might draw. There was no triptych. There wasn't even a road. Over the past quarter century, we have made a road by walking it, and we have been blessed to walk it with all of you. Now, in our time, we are being confronted by new questions and new challenges. How today does tolerance and hatred manifest itself in our religious communities? Who today are the objects of our religious ignorance and intolerance? The road which we have so carefully trod over these past 25 years is a road only in hindsight. Looking forward, there is still no blueprint. There are precious few models. Looking forward, there still is no road. The next generation of ICJS scholars and educators will do in their own time and in their own way what those of us who were there in the beginning did in our time, in our way. Make a road where there is none, built by women and men studying together, learning from and about one another, becoming friends. That is the fundamental work of the Institute, the creation of a safe space where ignorance gives way to knowledge and where knowledge gives way to hope. In closing, I would ask you to indulge me one personal note. Chris gave me no direction when he invited me to offer these remarks, perhaps because experience had taught him the futility of such direction, though I prefer to think that it had more to do with his enormous trust in my judgment. In any event, the only thing he did ask was that I share something of a personal nature on the impact of my work at the Institute. So I close with this story. I grew up in a pre-Vatican II church, and although I did not learn the actual phrase until college, I was a public, after all. A public, by the way, for those of you who aren't Catholics, is the pejorative word used to talk about those who didn't go to Catholic school. I am a public. Although I didn't learn that actual phrase until college, I knew it in my very bones. I knew the meaning of the phrase, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation. There is no salvation for me except in the church, and those outside the church are not saved. Throughout my years at the Institute, I have had the great and good fortune to teach and to be taught by women and men, clergy and lay, many, many of whom are in this room this evening, many of whom I am honored to call my friends. From them, I have learned that God's loving kindness, God's mercy, God's fidelity, God's abiding presence, and God's saving grace know no boundaries. In ways always surprising, they are embodied first in the world, and only by virtue of the church being in the world do they dwell there as well. And so, with all due respect to life forms residing on planets other than our own, or in a galaxy far, far away, extra ecclesiam nulla salus. Outside the church, there is no salvation, has been transformed for me to extra mundum nulla salus. Outside the world, there is no salvation. And from that singular learning, I will forever find myself in a new, redeemed and redeeming world. For that learning and for so much more, I shall be forever grateful. 25 years from now, when the ICJS gathers to celebrate its 50th anniversary, few of us, I suspect, will be sitting around these tables. Instead, we will be gathered around a different table, a heavenly banquet. We will lift our glasses high, and recalling that first creation account, we will look down upon our work, the work of the Institute, and together we will say, it is very good. Thank you. And now I would like to call upon George Hess, who has a brief, unscheduled addition to our program.
No gathering of this sort would be complete without recognizing the person who took Charlie Obrecht's vision of studying the differences and the similarities between Christianity and Judaism, making them challenging, making them all for us to learn and able to follow up by saying we understand one another better. The Reverend Christopher Layton, some 25 years ago, had a solid job at the Gilman School, and he left it. He left it to be the head of this organization that had a budget at that time of $50,000 for everything, including his salary. Let us all stand and give Chris a round of applause for a job well done.
One of my favorite comments was made by E.B. White. He remarked that he wakes up every day torn between a desire to change the world and a desire to have one hell of a good time. And he then noted that this makes it difficult to plan the day. At the ICJS, we've been blessed to do work that both changes the world and at the same time enables us to enjoy it. We know the urgency. We know that religious intolerance and the grip of ignorance must be broken, and that the virtue that may prove the most important for the ICJS is the virtue of endurance. The vice that most troubles and assails us is the vice of wishful thinking. So it is imperative to change the world, but it's been possible for me to enjoy the world because I've worked with exceptionally gifted and caring colleagues, and because I work for a board of directors, past and present, who insist on excellence, and they do all in their power to encourage bold thinking and innovative action. It is this alignment of talent that has enabled us to deliver on our promises. And there are so many people here in this room that really deserve to be acknowledged. Rather than offend just some of you, I'm going to offend all of you by refusing to name names. But the ICJS would have nothing to celebrate had it not been for all the friends, all the folks who are here, who have given so much of themselves, and their generosity has enabled us to fly higher than anyone expected. And I don't know if there is another city that could have pulled it off with such aplomb. If there's justice in the world to come, you will have a ringside seat at the Messianic banquet where we will feast on Leviathan instead of chicken. What we get here and now, if we can get a glimpse behind the appearances, we get a glimpse of the kingdom of God and the glimmer of a grand possibility. We have a vital role to play in making real our best and noblest hopes. It's work that demands us to embrace the challenge, to change the world, and to enjoy and treasure one another every step along the way. So enjoy your dessert, and thank you so much from the bottom of our hearts for pouring so much of your heart, mind, and soul into the work that needs to be done and needs to be continued in the years to come.
Chi vino
ויושיענו. זה אדוני קיווינו לו. נגילה ונשמחה בישועתה. נגילה ונשמחה בישועתה. We will be glad and rejoice in his salvation.